Welcome to Whistler's Vital Podcast, an initiative of Whistler Community Foundation. Podcasts with our host Kim Slater reflect Whistler's Vital Cafes, which have invited community members to toss the small talk and break into conversations about the big issues affecting our community.
Hello and welcome. I'm Kim Slater and I'm the Vital Cafe podcast host. Today's Vital Cafe podcast focuses on the climate crisis, a follow-up to the cafe that took place on January 16th and featured a panel of local climate experts and advocates, including my two guests today, Sue Maxwell and Arthur Jong, and also Diana Boone from AWARE's board, Christina Swearhern from the Whistler Naturalists, Max Neisweiser from the RMOW, he's the climate change coordinator, and then Irie Smith, who is a Whistler youth and climate advocate. So while not even 6 months has passed, January feels like a lifetime ago, thanks to the global pandemic. While the coronavirus crisis has been absorbing much of the world's attention, the climate crisis is still very much with us, and now our communities must figure out how recovery will substantially address both of these crises. So on the climate action side of things, here in Whistler, the RMOW has initiated the update to the Community Energy and Climate Action Plan, or CCAP, and is pursuing a big move strategy, which is focusing on Whistler's largest emission sources, including emissions from vehicles in the built environment. Staff will be going to council on July 7th with an information sharing report, then talking with key community partners over the early summer to prepare short-term priorities and take or continue action on several transit and transportation improvements. And the plan is to return to council in autumn for strategy adoption. Updates on the big moves will be posted to the RMOW website. I mention this as context to our discussion today, and also to thank the RMOW for the financial contribution to today's podcast. Now to dig into the other ways climate action is unfolding here in Whistler, I turn to my two wonderful guests and longtime friends and mentors. Sue Maxwell is principal of EcoInspire, a sustainability and zero waste planning firm. She was a former Whistler councillor and is a current Whistler resident going on about 12 years and second-time podcast guest. So welcome again, Sue.
Thank you.
And Arthur Jong has been with Whistler Blackcomb for 40 years. And in his current role as Senior Manager of Planning, he deploys pioneering efforts in the area of environmental planning and climate change action to both improve the guest experience and the natural environment. Arthur is a current member of council. Arthur, welcome.
Thank you, Kim. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for including me.
So given current social distancing precautions, we're trying this by Zoom, which seems to be one of the main ways we're all staying connected these days. We're going to talk about the cafe that happened in January. So we're going to have to think back a little bit. And my first question is, in one word, how would you describe the tone of the cafe? Sue, how's your memory bank doing?
That's good. I did have to think back because the world seemed very different back then. But I think one word would be motivational.
Great. Arthur, what was your sense?
Urgency, urgent. And I could tag that on both COVID and climate. We have a decade to reverse the climate issue. Very urgent.
Mm-hmm. And, kind of in light of that, we've had the recent declaration of a climate emergency, say thanks to the really wonderful advocating efforts of youth in our community. How would you say the declaration of a climate emergency shifts priorities or how we as a community are thinking about climate change? Arthur, you mentioned urgency and 10 years, and I've actually, I've read it's maybe even as much as 6 months. There's definitely a spectrum of beliefs on what emergency means. Have you seen a shift in priorities here?
I've certainly seen an expressed need for more action now. And I agree with your point that, in emergencies at 6 months, is it 10 years out? We don't really know with feedback loops scientifically where climate change exactly is at. So that's, that produces an acute versus a chronic condition. But to the question of where is our community at now? I think that next week's presentation on the big moves, that we have a great base, the CCAP plan, but there's over 130 actions, and when you try to do everything, you end up often doing nothing because you get spread in so many ways. So I'm delighted to see that we are going to sort of laser focus into the biggest emitters in our resort. And of course, it's 58% from transportation, and another 30% from buildings. And the big moves very much focuses on those key emission areas.
I'm not sure if you want to say a couple of words around how Big Moves came about. Where did that original thrust come from?
Well, now Sue has a lot more experience in the council, in the hot council seat than I do, but in my first 2 years, it became, and working with Max and Heather and other staff at the RMOW, and certainly very strong feedback from the community that we had to prioritize. We had to narrow in on where the big impacting actions were. So I was feeling it as a counselor at all levels that we need to get on with what now we are doing, producing 6 specific actions out of the 130 plus CCAP. And I'll turn it over to Sue, because Sue has a lot more tenure in that process.
Yeah, well, I think you're quickly catching up on me, Arthur, and almost at a more critical time. Back in the 90s, I think, it's like, we could reduce our climate emissions slowly and gradually make changes and we would have the impact. Or we could wait for a long time and do nothing and then potentially have some pretty catastrophic impacts and have to make changes really rapidly. And I think we have chosen the latter option, and now we are having to make changes rapidly. I think it'll be hard to separate out the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic from the actions on climate. I think it's shown us multiple things in terms of what we could be doing. But I think it's also having people stop for a moment and think about, how do we do things? And so if anything, it's become more urgent, but at the same time, just like what was predicted, there will be more emergencies happening all at once, which will diminish our capacity to deal with them.
Yeah, those are really interesting points, and kind of the intersection of COVID and climate is, I think, really raising the issue of how similar these two crises are, as well as you mentioned, it's kind of a positive feedback loop. We know that everyone is experiencing climate change and COVID, but it's very uneven, that experience. And the existing vulnerabilities of communities are really kind of brought to the fore in the wake of these crises. I found it really interesting how quickly society has changed, seemingly overnight. There was a really massive, very quick response, which is maybe a bit heartening, actually, that we can change so quickly. Do you feel that there's many lessons that have come out of pandemic, or emerging right now out of our pandemic response, that we might apply to addressing climate change? Sue?
Sure. I think a lot of people are taking time for reflection. They're realizing that perhaps simpler or slower can be good and rewarding, that relationships are important, that local can be really good. Maybe some of our global supply chains with the just-in-time ordering is not the way to go, and that maybe we need to be focusing a little bit more on resilience and having backup systems for things, that we don't need as much stuff and maybe not as much activity. And we really need to do things differently for both the planet and for people, because in addition to the COVID emergency, we are also seeing a lot of protests and talking about how people are treated. And so I think now is the perfect time to be rethinking how we do things.
Yeah. Arthur, do you have any thoughts on that? How COVID is maybe helping us reframe or think about climate change in important ways?
Certainly. And I use the analogy of the slow train versus the fast train. And most of society recognizes that COVID coming at us is like a fast train. We have to jump off the track for quickly, just to save our lives and stay healthy. And climate appears like a slow train. The problem is, as we continue to put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it becomes a runaway train. And unfortunately, our feet are stuck in the tracks. And that is so close. The similarities, so the sense of urgency should be treated more as the same. That's my my message there. Both crises know no borders. The poor and vulnerable are at greater risk with both. Neither is receiving the international leadership that it. We think of China, often just working to its own advantage, and then we look at the current state of the U.S., which scorns both often the World Health Organization and the Paris Accord, and so the response, arguably, has been stronger to COVID because of its obvious immediacy, but we need a collective international response for both. And right now, as we watch the U.S. with COVID, there's a lot of question marks. One of the lessons is economic stimulus. Many governments were quick to put money into the economy to really give it life support, and it was very quick. Governments now, with climate, need to be quick on the carbon tax. Economists often state this, that the only way that we're going to keep our climate below 2 degrees Celsius is to have a universal carbon tax. And so, again, that immediacy, we need to jump on climate with economic policy the way that many countries have with COVID, as well as all the technology lessons that we're learning on how to drive on the digital highway as opposed to be in our vehicles going to meetings, etc. Much more to say, but sorry, I'll leave it at that.
No, I mean, these are wonderful answers. They really kind of work across the spectrum of the sort of relational piece that you mentioned, Sue, and sort of, and actually very, interpersonal, like really taking a moment to reflect and to think about sort of our personal patterns and our personal complicity in climate change, all the way up to the sort of the bigger macro factors and thinking about economic stimulus and a universal carbon tax. So thank you. That was really, that was very well formed. It strikes me that, some of the issues around addressing climate change are really due to the fact that it's kind of like a contested thing. It means something different to different people. And very much so, the ways in which we define a problem inform the sort of solutions that we take or we try and put into effect. So I'm wondering, how do you define climate change, or what are the sort of the main sort of things I think that work around it that perhaps have it be stuck in a place where it's not changing, or we're not taking action fast enough? How do you kind of envision the greatest barriers to change on the climate front?
I think climate change is really a symptom of our system of consumption. And so it's one symptom, along with waste, along with inequity for people. It's a model that we have. And I think one of the barriers is that we have this story that we've told ourselves, which is unlimited economic growth is not only good, but it's necessary. And that somehow we can continue to grow our population and grow our extraction of resources across the planet with infinitely and without any consequences. And this is sort of an economic story we've told ourselves. But I think what we're starting to realize, like, when you have too many fish in a tank and they start to grow and you start to pollute the tank and you start to experience it, we're polluting our tank and we're starting to see what the consequences are. And so I think we need to change that story. We can't be teaching in Economics 100 that infinite growth is possible. We need to be saying, attach it to science. The only income we have is the solar energy coming into the earth. Otherwise, we're a finite system. And so, yes, we have had technological advances that have made us more efficient, but we've often used that efficiency not to use less resources, but to use more resources and for more people. And so I think we need to change that story. And that's why this time for many of us of living more simply, more quietly, smaller, slower, is a good lesson to show that it is possible. So yeah, I think we need to change our story.
Arthur?
I think we need to use our imagination and our vision and reposition, redefine what quality of life is at times. I mean, we have become, and as Sue is, I'm just supporting Sue's comment that we've become so materialistic that we've lost the sense of quantity versus quality. We know that we have to shift from a consumer society to a sustainable one. But what I often position to my friends is that, frankly, if you eat a plant-based diet and cycle more, are you really giving up on lifestyle? Frankly, your lifestyle and your health is better. There's so many elements to this that as we need to do a better job of stewarding our planet, we end up stewarding ourselves better. There are so many win-wins. So I believe in how we position tackling climate change stewardship at the individual level. It's not about giving up things. It's about making things better for both the planet and ourselves. I know that sounds motherhood, but I can say from personal experience, it's a win-win.
Yeah, I'd have to say I echo those comments completely. It strikes me that, as we move into, we're really deep into a digital age that promises more connectivity. In so many ways, we've lost so much really important kinds of connection. I think that centering those elements, we end up with a more rewarding lifestyle. There's a net benefit. We shouldn't be striving for net zero. We should be striving for net positive in all of our endeavors. So yes, I those comments are very they really resonate with me. In terms of thinking about, we won't stay too sort of negative for too much longer, but how those sort of barriers come up here in Whistler. So centering on our community. And I'm wondering what the Vital Cafe participants had to say, where they thought our community was, maybe stalled or was more challenged in kind of moving the dial and some of these things that you've mentioned.
Arthur, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, it's complex in that, I feel like I got to drag the elephant in the room right away. And Whistler, if we can resolve our transportation and with the big moves, we will make some dramatic changes. And some of the comments that I certainly take away from the Vital Cafe, and it gets so much more challenging when we look at the transportation footprint, carbon emissions coming here, and how do we play not just clean up our own locker room, get our greenhouse gas emissions here in Whistler down 30-40%. How do we influence the rest of tourism to do that? And it is challenging, but I think that as we really push down our carbon footprint, and we've done some great work, we do become more attractive to guests who are very concerned about their footprint. We need to partner more in regional transit. I mean, there's a whole story there. I'm not sure that in my political term that I'm going to be in the aircraft manufacturing hangars of Airbus and Boeing. But there's a huge question there. I think that we need to position tourism and travel differently. Travel less, stay longer. I think there's certain strategies that we can promote here in Whistler that can nudge global tourism. We are a global village. We need to be a global light. One of the things I've learned to do is if I have to business travel, I try to combine my business travel with my vacation time. So thereby, cutting my air miles in half. So maybe in the future when we can gather large groups of people again in business conferences, that we do more to do a hybrid tourism business package as an example. And I'm just throwing this as one idea with the elephant in the room question. And that's often certainly thrown at me at the Vital Cafe and with community members, because we are a tourism destination. It's really almost impossible to change that. And ultimately we built a place where people need to come to visit, be motivated to visit here, and be able to afford to. And that model gets broken. We've gone down this road as a destination resort for so long. So accepting that, but how then do we become a global inspiration?
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points, because I think at Vital Cafe, what we heard is a lot of people were answering the question about what are you doing personally? And so a lot of people were taking some great steps. But I think when it gets hard, because it's easy to do things in your own home, takes some time, takes establishing new habits, but it is much harder to do things when the system is driving you in the opposite direction. So I think what we were hearing is that we need to be bolder. We need, for a long time, we've been worried about offending one or two other groups. And I think it's really, now that we've got to this very urgent state, we need to be bolder. We need to say, okay, collectively, we need to change the system so that the easiest option is the most carbon-friendly option, not the hardest option is the most carbon-friendly option. And so really shifting that mindset and really starting to do some bigger, bolder things. And that's what the virus has shown us that we can do if we put our minds to it and if we're collectively concerned enough that we need to make changes.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely could take from this and see, the ways in which we're piloting this sort of like remote ability to come together, whether it's conference products or things like that. We do get a moment here to, I think, kind of test some new approaches that maybe have some legs into the future. Kind of flipping gears here, where do you think our community is excelling on the climate action front? And we can maybe think about that in terms of our business community, but then also we've talked a lot about the RMOW, and then some citizen efforts that have been happening.
I think a lot of individual businesses in town are actually taking some great steps, and that can be small businesses or, like the Epic Promise from Vail was fantastic. And so there's a lot of commitments that are being made by businesses, and there's a lot of work that's being done behind the scenes. I think we could maybe do more to highlight some of those things so that we all understand who's doing what and kind of set the new norm for having businesses share best practices. I'm really excited that the 6 big moves are coming forward. So I think government working on implementing actions, hoping that despite the pandemic, that the work on Clean BC and that some of the commitments from the federal government are not getting derailed. And then citizens. I went to Nesters the other day, and there's like more and more e-bikes and electric cars that are parked out. Well, I don't see the e-bikes parked because people might be a little concerned about leaving them locked up, but you certainly see the electric cars, a lot more people talking about vegetarian meals, and a lot more awareness and organizing. So really hands up to the students at Whistler High School in terms of organizing that climate rally and starting to speak out and say it's urgent and we need to move faster, and it's our generation that's really going to bear the brunt of it.
Could you just share a few words about Clean BC?
Yeah, so Clean BC is the BC provincial government's initiative that is looking at how to address climate change. And they had a climate leadership team made up of leaders from different sectors, including municipalities and all kinds of sectors, coming up with a plan on how we can make meaningful change on carbon. Could it be better? For sure, but at least it's something, and I think we want to push that as much as possible.
And you said there's some partnerships there between different groups or different stakeholders?
More that the climate leadership team included was an advisory team, but it included First Nations and municipal leaders as well as industry leaders and activists, some activist groups as well. So trying to hear from a broad spectrum of people about what is possible in BC.
Arthur, any thoughts on where our community is excelling and some maybe some personal examples from Whistler Blackcomb?
Yeah, I'd delighted to answer that because I'll try to take it from the corporate, municipal, and individual level here. And I'll start with the corporate. And there's a good news story here and very recent as well. But it goes back to earlier days at WB when we struggled to define our environmental vision, and we chose zero operating footprint. And a lot of people thought that I was, some form of drug-induced semi-hairless hippie because it's impossible. You're not going to get there. And then we had the Fitzsimmons project, which hydroelectricity generated that in the Fitzsimmons that matched our annual consumption. And suddenly that goal became very real. And with Vail Resorts, they grabbed that concept, zero operating footprint, made it titled as Committed to Zero. And just several days ago, an announcement was made that an investment on an 82 wind turbine wind farm in Nebraska, which Vail invested in, is just now gone online, is operating, and it generates about 90% of all the energy demands of Vail resorts. The idea was 100%, but a few more resorts were bought after the investment in the farm. So I bring this up because here's an example of where we can export environmental strategy and make a greater difference. And I expect to see more of that from WV and from Vail. At the personal level now, the culture in this community in terms of environmental stewardship is very deep. I love interviewing the cashiers and clerks, whether it be at Creekside Market or Nestor's or the employees at our government liquor stores, because they know us. And I get great data. How many locals are using single-use plastic? And the answer I get constantly is only about 10%. And recycling habits and whatnot like that. Our community is really dialed on this. But government needs to do more to support that and certainly drive the change more with our guests and create a positive experience for our guests, a learning experience for our guests. And here's where the frustration lies. And Sue, you'll certainly identify with this. It didn't take me long to become a frustrated city councilor, because when I quickly learned that we could not bylaw regulations specific pertinent to waste and greenhouse gas reduction, I kind of lost it, because at the provincial and federal levels, we have these goals which are aligned with the IPCC, and that's great. But where does most of the waste where's most of the waste generated in greenhouse gas emissions? At the local level, over 80% are generated at the local level. But yet local governments are not empowered to pass bylaws that can help move the dial on waste and greenhouse gas reduction. So that's my battle as a councillor. And I hope before the end of my term that we're going to get a lot of yardage there, because we need to support our businesses and our community more and actually bylaw the actions that our community want. And under the Local Government Act, we are pretty much just an arm of provincial legislation, and that needs to change. So we have work to do there.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting tension, right? That there's, arguably the most potential, municipalities in some ways are able to make change at a level that is the most impactful. So I think there's a lot of sort of hope. We know that, about 80% of Canadians live in cities. So there's a sense that, action is happening at the city level. And yet, as you've mentioned, there are these things that lock into place the status quo. So, whether that's building code or local government act. So, I'm delighted to hear that maybe there's some other ways of kind of making that, adjusting that. Sue, maybe you want to speak to that more so. Is there a timeline on some of those things that you're working on? Or?
Because it's from the powers are given by the provincial government, the timeline will be determined by the provincial government. But I think collective action by elected officials through UBC, the Union of BC Municipalities, or other organizations can help. I think also there's sometimes workarounds. So with the plastic bag bans that we saw, questions whether or not local governments have the ability to regulate it for environmental reasons, although they can for financial reasons. I think the workaround on that was that, you ask the provincial government to approve your bylaw, and if they say yes, then they go ahead. And I think the more local governments that ask for very similar bylaws, and if one's already passed in one jurisdiction, and if it aligns with the provincial government direction, then it becomes a bit of a no-brainer. And so I think in the meantime, that can be the workaround. But ideally, when we realize the multiple crises we're facing, particularly for climate and ecologically, we need to be able to empower our local governments to make the regulations that would help to solve some of these problems.
That's a great point, because in fairness to provincial legislation, if you have municipality A doing something one way and municipality B doing something another way, and it gets neurotic in terms of how do you then regionally systemize for example, waste flows. So legitimately, I understand the molasses pace of provincial legislation, but this is a climate crisis emergency. The province recognizes it. So, damn it, empower us then to take care of it.
Given the magnitude of the climate emergency and the planetary stakes, it's easy to be fatalistic. So I'm wondering, both of you, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? What do you say to those, especially young people, who maybe have a grim outlook? And I know that there were a couple at the cafe.
I mean, I think it's hard not to be pessimistic when we look at the news, particularly when we look at, say, the pandemic as an example, and we look at the different ways that different governments are handling it, and sometimes the way that different groups are handling it. So when there's a lot of fear or a scarcity of resource, are we coming together and solving it appropriately, or are we dividing up and blaming others? So I think that can be a bit pessimistic. Now, I'm not saying don't watch the news, because it's really important that people are well informed about what's going on in the world. But I think where I am more optimistic is when I take a look at the community, like all of the people that came out to the Vital Signs Cafe were passionate about it. They were doing things in their own lives. They wanted things more broadly to happen as well. And I think it's through organizing and being linked with other people who are of like mind, because it's very easy to be, oh, I'm the only one that thinks like this, and I'll just be quiet. But once you start not being quiet anymore, saying what you think, and working collectively to address whatever barriers are that we see, I think that's where we'll see more change. And I think that's what makes me optimistic. Arthur?
I draw my hope, my strength, inspiration from young people. And just a little bit of a journey here. My environmental journey started in 1993, and it was a long time ago. And it was really tough in terms of trying to push my generation, baby boomers. But as I worked through each of the younger generations, it seemed to get easier and easier. When I'd go to universities, I didn't have to spend 45 minutes trying to push a message. It would only take 11, 12 minutes, and then the classroom would light up. And these are millennials. The ownership, the concern, the comprehension of our climate crisis was far deeper. And now we have the Gretas standing up for their generation. About half the world's population is under the age of 30. And I think that through the younger generations, we can get the job done. They have to become the political voice. Sorry, I just paused here for a minute. A bear is just walking by my window. I love Whistler. and that bear's future generations need to survive as well. So it's young people that give me hope. I'll also say this, that sometimes you find answers in the most unusual places. I mean, we're very critical of the markets pushing growth, but yet I'm seeing some very interesting things happen in the markets now. Tesla yesterday was given the highest valuation of all automotive in the world. And that's based, not on what they're selling today. It's the market saying what they're going to sell tomorrow. And I was reading about a private equity firm not too long ago, BlackRock, and their CEO, who was noted as a kind of a laggard on climate change, has actually done a 180. They see clean tech as, I believe, a $32 trillion opportunity in the future. And again, markets don't look at what's happening today. They anticipate what is going to happen tomorrow. We as consumers, as investors, need to drive that, to actually validate that perspective. And taking it to the individual level, if everyone took account of their own carbon footprint, especially in the G7 and G20 countries, G7 countries, which includes Canada, emit half the world's global emissions. The G20 countries, about 75%. So in the wealthy countries that we are, if we all took individual ownership, the markets will turn on that tomorrow. We need to not underestimate that power, but we as individuals need to initiate that.
Wow, those are really, really powerful statements. Thank you so much. I know that especially a lot of young people who are, struggling to feel like what they're doing is making a difference. It's so important, I think, to consider that this is a multi-pronged effort. It needs to happen at all scales, at and across all scales. So the work we're doing in our households as well as in the community are all vitally important. And I think also just, doing this work with others is so just filled with energy. The more you get to kind of meet folks who are really active in the climate action space, it's hard to not be inspired, is my experience. There's definitely some reserves of energy there, even though the task is formidable. So I thank you so much for your careers, your lifetimes of dedication to making a difference around climate and just making our communities better. Thank you so much. That concludes our podcast today. I don't know if either of you have any kind of closing words, anything we didn't get to.
Nothing that we didn't get to, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for putting this together. And also, it's lovely to have a conversation with Arthur, and we don't have enough time just to sit down and hear what's going on. So thank you.
It's time for a coffee, Sue, and I have so much to learn from you on your experience as a counselor. Yes, Kim, thank you. Community Foundation. I'm just going to finish with, I've traveled all over the world in my day job, looking at different resorts. There's nothing like Whistler in terms of a embedded community, a very diverse ecosystem here. The infrastructure that we've placed in it has made us the greatest resort in the world. And so my takeaway on it is that we need to step up our game on inspiring global tourism, on environmental stewardship for every reason. And thank you for allowing me to speak on this podcast. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful.
Thanks for listening to Whistler's Vital Podcast. You can find us and all the links to our social media at whistlerfoundation.com. And please don't forget to share this episode and start a conversation of your own.